Welcome.
Hi.
I made the mistake of having to physically admit one by one every person. Oh, there we go. Admit all. Hello there.
Hi.
Oh, thank you, Jeffrey, for that. I think I figured it out. Hey, hello, everyone. Everyone getting on okay, I hope, amidst the global situation. Great to see everyone. I'm glad that this is sort of working. Welcome to Reza.
Hi, everyone. Yeah.
Hi, welcome.
Thanks, Daniel. Good to see you all.
Simultaneity. We're all here. This has been, I guess, over a month in planning. And oh, we have Glenn. Excellent. And I chose to do the meeting format as opposed to the webinar format on Zoom. And I think by now everyone is very familiar with Zoom. Unfortunately, we are all too familiar with Zoom. So the good and the bad with that, I think, is that we know how to mute ourselves and sort of follow this sort of etiquette of Zoom so that we have a good experience. Welcome to Daniel Erickson.
Hello.
And so it is a large group, and that's excellent. We have over 115 people that have signed up. Today, I think we're expecting maybe 70, 65, 70. It's automatically recording. I'm not quite sure how to manage the recording. I'm not interested per se in making it publicly available. I'm more interested in maybe posting it on our Slack so that folks who are a part of this group can watch it in the event that they're in a different time zone or they couldn't make it today. In part because this portion of what we're doing right now is by no means meant to be a formal presentation. This is adopting sort of the Lacanian notion of the +1 for each of the next 2 sessions, this one and then 2 more until the end of the month. We will have a +1. I don't know if you all are familiar with this kind of general concept. The basic notion with it is you sort of have it's the cartel structure. Obviously, we are a large cartel. Usually a cartel is a handful of people. And the way it works is you sort of have a discussion leader who provides their own idiosyncratic interpretation on the fly. I noticed from the notes that I've shared, and I'm very happy that people are already using that Google document of notes on the text. People develop very singular interpretations of anthropology of the name, I think, and that's very good. Maybe ironic too. The text has so much precision in terms of terms and concepts and so on. So maybe that's actually something we could explore in the Slack or even in our conversations. But the function of the facilitator of what I'm calling the plus one will really be to provide their own sequential reading. We want to get through the text by the end of the month. I've already had, and I really appreciate this, at least 2 people email me and sort of throw their hands up and say, look, this is too much for me. My brain hurts from reading this book. And I've had other folks say, well, you know, I'm not really up for the level of complexity that Lazarus is operating at. And I think that humbly, we are all there. I think some of us have a lot more background. Some of us have read this text. Some of us are very familiar with the specific context of Lazarus in French militant life, his relationship with Alain Badiou. And those of us that have that knowledge, I think, can play a very important role in helping to sort of crystallize certain concepts as they emerge. So, but nonetheless, for the first 3 sessions, we want to work through the text. By the last session, on the 4th session, we will have a plenary, which will consist of more formal presentations, and we'll probably make that public, sort of through YouTube maybe. And I've invited some sort of more preeminent thinkers on Lazarus to present. I've reached out to Bruno Bostiels and Peter Hallward. We'll see if they're available. I've reached out to the various African thinkers on Lazarus, Neocosmos and Wamba Diawamba. We hope they will confirm. Neocosmos seems very possible. It would be interesting if we could hear from Alain Badiou himself. I know that he was supposed to be at UCLA, and I know that he also very much dislikes this kind of format that we're in, having done one of these events with him before. It went fine, but it's just not his preferred mode of operation, mode of delivery, mode of transmission. But we'll see. And of course, let me also begin by introducing Assad Haider and Gabriel Tupanamba, who are 2 thinkers and militants that I really felt would be very useful guides as we examine this book. If I could just ask Assad to say hello and see how you're doing, and welcome people as well.
Hello. Hi, everyone. I'm all right.
Welcome. Gabriel, are you with us? So Gabriel is a Brazilian-based psychoanalyst and sort of political actor that has used Badiou and Lazarus quite extensively and published on them. And he will be presenting the last one. And we also have, of course, Robin Morosco. Robin, are you with us?
I am here. Hi, everyone.
Oh, there you are. Hello. Welcome, Robin. Thank you for being willing to give a presentation on Lazarus on May 30th. We're very excited about that. Gabriel will be the +1 or the facilitator next time. I will take up the duty this time. I have read this book once before. I have done a PhD with Alain Badiou and really look a lot at his ethics and his politics. So I'm very much interested in the sort of relationship between these 2 thinkers. In some sense, they are the Marxist version of Deleuze and Guattari in terms of political thinking, if you like. And I want to also flag something for those of us that feel that this book is a kind of insurmountable activity in terms of its difficulty, which is the wonderful article by the Australian-based Francophone specialist and philosopher Rob Boncardo. I don't know if Rob is with us. It's quite early in Australia. Rob has gone back into the UCFML, the Union of Marxist-Leninists, French communists, I believe is the sort of rough translation of the political militant effort that Lazarus and Badiou engaged in prior to '68 and then up to maybe the late '70s. They had about 400 members. They had a magazine, a newspaper that was sort of distributed. Rob has written an article called The End of the Dialectic. I'm sorry, The Last Days of the Dialectic. Very useful reference point for all of us to sort of ground the practical reflection that composes anthropology of the name. So I highly recommend that. It's in the Slack group, it's in the Google document group. The other thing I would recommend is to engage with Badiou's lecture in the 1983, early 80s, at an effort that was actually sparked by an essay by Derrida called The Ends of Man. And this sparked the creation of a sort of quasi-think tank, which went by the name of the Center for Philosophical Research on the Political. So here you have a number of presentations on an interrogation of where we are with the very category of the political. Pardon me, let me admit more people. And here is Badiou amongst all of these philosophers, including folks like Jean-Luc Nancy, Derrida himself, Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe, people who are interrogating these categories of the political, of community, very much in dialogue with the kind of world historical situation of the fall of really existing socialism or the imminent fall of it, and a kind of effort for a sort of seismic reevaluation of the relationship of philosophy to politics. And here Badiou produces a text which has recently been translated by Bruno Bostiels, which is entitled, Can Politics Be Thought? And in this book, or rather in this text, which is really a lecture, we see a sort of culmination of all of the very interesting work from the UCFML, the practical militancy work that Badiou had engaged in, as well as the evolution of his own political thought since the publication of Theory of the Subject, which was really a kind of, in a certain sense, a retrospect on the fallout of '68 and the outcome of this new situation that had opened in France, but in the global situation more generally. And Theory of the Subject is my favorite Badiouian text. It's a highly speculative, very strange book, which I think is a wonderful way to start with Badiou's work. It's structured in a Lacanian seminar format, and it is in deep dialogue with a kind of practical manual for how to lead a militant life from the standpoint of ethics, but from the standpoint of a complete reevaluation of the dialectic itself, of where we are at with Marxism. So I highly recommend that. But by the time he publishes Can Politics Be Thought, he is entering into a completely new sphere of thinking. And now Marxism is completely detethered from what Lazarus will call the statist form. It's completely detethered. It is no longer capable of being thought within representation. And so you have a kind of torsion version of Marxism, and you have a version of Marxism which is emphasizing the necessity to radically break from the prior sequence. And there is a kind of tacit understanding that the prior sequence, namely for Badiou and Lazarus, this is the project of Leninism, is finished. And so the task is the task that Marx had in 1848, which is a sort of return to not a sort of immutable thesis of Marxism qua class struggle. This would be far too scientific. This would be far too objectivist. The task is to return to what Marx defined his innovation. And both Lazarus and Badiou love this reference, and I love this reference as well. But it's in a letter that Marx wrote to a figure called Weidemeyer. Is anybody familiar with this letter? I actually will share the link for you. Take a brief pause, and I found this quite interesting because one of the ways to understand what Lazarus calls the prescriptive element of Marxism, or what Badiou calls the communist hypothesis, is to, hold on, how do I make it to everyone? Sorry. Okay. I think this might have just gone to Jeffrey. Hold on a second, I apologize. Pop out. Okay, so if I go to, does it only let me send to one person? That is obscene. My God.
I just sent it to everyone.
Well, if somebody could Google, oh, there you have it. Oh, Jeffrey, if you could do that. You got it, okay. So I think this is quite interesting because what we're experiencing here is a sort of complete reappraisal of the novelty of Marx's insight. And the novelty is structured around the sort of notion that Marxism, or what Marx discovered, was a thesis of separation and unbinding. And so you have this significant insight, and Lazarus will give this a very central place in this text. And I think it's probably one of the most important concepts to sort of navigate this text with. In the case of Marx, Lazarus says the separation was between politics and philosophy. In the case of Lenin, the separation that was enacted in his thought, the novelty of his thought, was between politics and, what is it? Politics and war, I believe. It's sort of this this notion that for Lenin and for Marx, they were both capable of identifying the existence of not class struggle as such in an objective sense, but the possibility for the subtraction of the proletariat from capitalist society. And that within that subtraction, there emerges a space where a new decision can be enacted. And so you have a kind of very interesting emergence here, which is, I would say, one way to really understand this. It's a very unique kind of French Cartesian understanding. And by that I mean, and even Pascalian, by that I mean that if the novelty of Marxism is based in this hypothesis or in this space of the prescriptive, that means that what is necessary is for us to create a certain epistemology that enables the proletariat to effectively enter into that space of thinking, right? So therefore, consciousness, or what's novel about consciousness, is not derived from class struggle per se. It is actually derived from a subtraction of the proletariat and their relationship to thought and their relationship to the decision of thought. So it is not the subjectivity of the proletariat that is of interest to us. It is the capacity of the proletariat to enter into a space of thinking. one of the very interesting consequences of this is, of course, that antagonism that the proletariat experiences is, in fact, no longer a sort of teleological type of antagonism. In other words, it does not produce a revolutionary moment. So you have to sort of think about both the intervention of Lazarus and Badiou, I think, from this kind of necessity or the centrality of thought, which I think for many people in an American context, especially with our long experience of pragmatism, of empiricism. I mean, in Can Politics Be Thought, Badiou says very clearly, empiricism is a weak philosophical orientation. It is not capable of entering into the kind of relationship he's after. So I think, therefore, perhaps that brings a sort of foreignness, perhaps for some of us, to that type of thinking of revolutionary thought. That's just my wager. I wonder if others sort of agree with that or have thought about it.
Well, can I talk for a second?
Please.
What I wanted to say is, okay, it's very striking and quite interesting, but I'm stumbling a little bit here on how we can simply, shall we say, separate from the notion itself of consciousness being derived from class struggle, or even a naturalism of utopic or revolutionary desire arising from the dialectic of class struggle. In other words, another way of putting it, can we really, properly speaking, describe or discuss the concept of proletariat without that being inherently, constitutively determined as such by a dialectic with capitalist class power? Now, I don't mean that hegemonically, I mean that structurally.
Yeah.
So that hegemonically, indeed, they're correct in being critical of the empirical, mind trap, let's call it for a moment. I'm being a little bit loose and lazy, but that's a problem. So if we just talk about it in structural terms, I'm stumbling here about how we can even really, it seems to me, I don't know if I would call it idealist, but something like atomistic or returning to a Spinoza-ism of elements, that of substances that I do think Hegel, etc., is more in line with contemporary physics in the sense of, I don't necessarily need it, but that we don't just have substances, we have metabolic change. So we don't have forever substances. There isn't forever a proletariat. We have actually transformative things with byproducts, et cetera. If we're going to use the metaphor from biology or thermodynamics, et cetera.
Yeah.
So I'm a little worried here. I'm just going to express that anxiety about how do we make that move, really, to start to understand the proletariat.
Well, I think one of the ways, and I want others to jump in here, and I think, Andrew, you start off with a really nice interrogation. On page 44 of the text, towards the end of chapter 1, you'll see that Lazarus says, quote, "For Lenin, consciousness is conditioned on an antagonism towards the existing social order."
Right.
Thus, it cannot be argued that it is antagonism that constitutes consciousness. It appears instead to be one of its propositions, right? So there is a certain sense in which the prescriptive sort of becomes a feature for, in other words, there's not a relationship between the suffering or the degradation of proletarian life and then a kind of a comic book causality, you know what I mean, whereby that suffering would then have sort of congeal in consciousness. I mean, I think for Lenin, this is exemplified in his thesis of the vanguard intellectual and the role of the vanguard intellectual as being sort of subtracted from certain suffering of everyday proletarian life in order to have a separation from it. And I believe that this is a very novel point. And I think that it is something which, for a lot of kind of vulgar Marxists, or even a kind of American empirical orientation, one would think that antagonism is housed in this way. But this, I think, also is very much a thread of anti-humanism that's present here. This is the proposal of a kind of humanist Marxism would also follow into this. But I invite others to, please, you have your hand up, go, please.
Yeah, so my name is Drew. Thank you all. Nice to meet all of you. It seems to me, though, that proletariat is not a big category for him, right? Like, so far he's introduced...
I can't hear you well, Drew. Can you...
Oh, sorry. It doesn't seem to me that the proletariat is a big category for him, because actually it only introduces 3 categories, right? Regarding one is the worker militant, the worker figure. Number 2 is class, which he thinks is actually saturated as a conceptual category, and number 3 is the people. So I'm not sure where the figure of the proletariat actually fits in. If anything, it seems to me that he would probably see that as part of the saturated sequence, which ends with the Bolshevik experience and leads into like Mao, for example. So I'm not. I'm sure others have other things to say, but it seems to me that those are the 3 categories we have to be sort of dealing with, not necessarily the category of the proletariat. And I think the struggle there becomes, for me, and I think the key term used is idealism. He keeps on talking about this idea of thought as an interiority, and without any kind of reference to the object. So this is even a more radicalized move than Althusser's. And number 2, it's got no necessary reference to the real. So in that case, isn't the interiority of thought a form of idealism, because it's just thought of thought of thought in kind of an infinite regress? But that may be a very unfair position.
Drew, thank you for that intervention. You've given us a lot to work with, and I think for the purpose of contextualizing this text as a Marxist text in some sense, or as a text which is sort of tethering with the Marxist tradition. Clearly he's doing so. Clearly there was a form of the worker within the sequence of Leninism, which has reached a saturation point. And part of the reason why I wanted everyone to read Boncardo's intervention is because really he helps us see all of the kind of specific names and even the sites that were palpable for Lazarus from the Caesura of 68 up until the early 80s. And it was in that mode of a kind of, this is the key point, in that mode, Lazarus was practicing a strict Marxist-Leninism. Boncardo says it was chemically pure. I think it's a very useful point. So in other words, as a kind of looking back, as what he calls the method of saturation on his own political militancy from that time, he's able to gauge what is no longer novel or what no longer has efficacy within the various sites of revolutionary Leninism. You see my point? So all I was saying about all of this stuff is I think that most of us, or many of us, are coming to this book as committed Marxists. We are coming to this, the title we've given this is Socialists Think. So and I think this is something we should be tracking, people have raised the question of idealism. Is a politics of interiority an idealist project, or is it, as Badiou calls his own revision of the dialectic, idealism without idealism, instead of a replacement of idealism, right? So that, I invite others to jump in, and I guess the means by which you can jump in is to sort of just speak, because there's too many people to sort of, for me to manage the hand raising. So I invite, others to at any time.
I'm very daunted to make this kind of, I don't know, venture this thought, but guess I could just ask you to clarify that point about class consciousness being allowed by effective subtraction. I guess the thing that comes to mind, and maybe this is just because I read it recently, Jean Kopchak has this essay, A City Divided. I won't get into all the details, but she's essentially providing a Lacanian reading of Kant's notoriously opaque claim in the third critique that the, beautiful symbolizes morality. And what she asserts is that we read the beautiful not as a representation, but as the Lacanian semblance, that which makes nothing appear. And thus what allows the subject to make this pure ethical act is the semblant. It is imagining its own, in the matter of, she says, of like in a topological fashion, or as an envelope. The subject thinks its own subtraction from the world and then puts it back. I don't know if she ties this ultimately to Badiou's notion of the axiom of equality versus the program of quality. And I don't know, am I on the right scent here?
Yeah. No, definitely. And Robin just sent a nice message around this question of the decision. So you have a sort of necessity of a rethinking, a reexamination of politics, because so if, as Badiou writes in Can Politics Be Thought, that there is a kind of historic diminishment or retreat of the political as a sort of fundamental category, which then beckons philosophers back to the table. Like philosophers now have a major role to play within the kind of Marxian tradition, let's say. This is again in about the early 1980s. And of course, we'll talk about periodization later. It's very interesting that there is a sort of idea for Badiou that really capital parliamentary ordinary politics is not politics. You sort of have what he's saying, logics of worlds. This is sort of atonalism. This is reliant on paraconsistent logic. There's no capacity for subtraction. There's no ability to enter into spaces of novel political thinking, right? You rather need to intervene in what he calls pre-political situations. And they are amongst us. There are many pre-political situations. And the first step would be to, in a Maoist sense, engage in inquiries, worker inquiries, right? Where you identify possible nominations of points that are rupturing the law. So rupturing the law of the ordinary flow of life, the ordinary flow of capital life, and so on. And so I think it's that kind of point at which he then thinks an event. So an event is not some thing from outside which magically, transcendentally just appears. It's rather a very specific intervention after a set of inquiries have occurred in which certain visible changes can be observed and so on. You know what I mean? So anyways, we're speaking very generally about the text, and my intention, even though we're about half an hour into this, and I think it's good to start generally, is to sort of go through in a sequential way, and I do want to start that soon. I also want to say one thing, which is there's a lot of people, and we're very grateful for that. On Slack, it would be wonderful to introduce one another, since we don't have really time to do that, given that we have 60 people. We'll try to find a way to do that. I think it would be really, really useful to sort of know who people are, just as an aside. So anyways, so Are there any other general comments about contextualizing this book before we formally jump into it? I invite others to sort of just speak.
I mean, I guess one place I would.
But can you announce your name before you speak?
Yes, I'm sorry. My name is Alex Gorman. I guess the question that I have is like the relationship between Lazarus and Badiou's notion of thought in interiority to idealism, because like one of the things that I've found with Badiou is that there seems to be a kind of attempt at escaping from the sort of distinction between materialism and idealism that is on the side of materialism, but wants to sort of engage with those categories differently. And I guess I just am sort of wondering, like, what do we mean, you know, what does it mean when we speak about the distinction, right? Because it's not entirely clear to me what idealism signifies, especially at least within this context.
Yeah, I think I was trying to sort of frame a little bit of background on the relationship of Lazarus's Marxism and Badiou's Marxism. And I think this idealism category sort of emerged in part because of the centrality of thought in relationship to political organization. And there's a sort of, I don't know, a sort of general allergy to that and an immediate assumption. However, why don't we do this? Let's hold this question until we reach what Lazarus says about the dialectic, because I think it's there in his specific notion of how the dialectic is to be revised, that I think we can begin to interrogate the status of idealism or not in Lazarus. Is that fair, Alex?
Yes, that's fair.
Okay, yeah, because I don't want to sort of jump the gun. You know what I mean? Like,
Sure.
we have a lot of work to do here if we want to go through this text.
I have also just some thoughts on how to approach the text. One thing I just wanted to flag, since consciousness has come up, this is in the following section, but it's on page 83, which I will just read. It says, taken as a category of investigation, consciousness is not suited for investigating the subjective. As a category of investigation and contrary to what I thought, I now see the category of consciousness as desubjectivating. It is therefore an unusable category. Now, it's very difficult to square this with the language of the rest of the text. And so I just wanted to bring this up, which we can address when we get to this chapter. But in terms of the general approach to the book, one thing that I think is interesting is that it in no sense situates itself as a philosophical text. It announces itself as being an anthropology of the name, and what anthropology means is unclear. And then quickly adds that its area of investigation is politics. And so it's from the framework of an undefined anthropology specifying the question of politics. And so the questions of philosophy appear in some sense to be outside of the scope of the text. But then we get, I think, and I think that this is actually a very careful, rational elaboration of the argument, despite the impenetrable character. But we have very clear theses and objects of inquiry. So we have the axioms. People think thought is a relation of the real, and then he doesn't make this one of the axioms, but he says it, and Badiou picks up on it and so on, which is that politics is of the order of thought, or politics is thought. So it seems that these axioms, which seem to be very general or seem to be engaged in some kind of philosophical speculation, people think thought is of the order, is a relation of the real, they are actually political axioms. And so one thing, it's very interesting, I think, to figure out what that means, that we are starting with an investigation of politics, which is not philosophical, which begins with the axioms about thought. Second, you know, there's this funny anecdote about Badiou and Negri having an argument at one of the Idea of Communism conferences, in which Negri says to Badiou, it's possible to be a communist without being a Marxist, and Badiou answers, well, it's also possible to be a Marxist without being a communist. And the question of the alignment between Marxism and communism here, to me, is not resolved. What I certainly think is that this is an investigation of communism. And here, what we get very clearly is a historical investigation of communism according to two particular sequences, which are classism and Leninism, which are totally distinct. And a great deal of the understanding of politics, in my view, hinges on understanding, first of all, what classism is, how it comes to be saturated or complete, and then what distinguishes Leninism from it. And then the modes that come after, I think, are not as substantive as the distinction between these two. So for me, just in my own reading, these are the themes and the specific, very specific problems that are laid out.
Thank you, Assad. That's very helpful. And I think, yeah, we will have to keep in suspense, and part of this is to kind of keep our desire tethered to this book. Perhaps it is that few people finish this book because of its difficulty, and that's why there's so many people interested, that we need each other to finish this book, to finish it well, to finish it clearly. So that's very helpful. Let's examine the preface, which, you know, clearly the preface is excellent in terms of offering a glossary of the key terms that are being dealt with in the book. At times, you feel as if you want to pull your hair out later in the book, because it's a circular logic. There's a term that's referring to another term, and they're kind of all caught up within almost like a university discourse or something, like kind of something completely of its own creation. But then Lazarus will give a kind of example, and you say, oh, okay, that kind of makes sense now, right? So, you know, the first thing is, you know, he says that he's interested in the category of the people, obviously not from a populist standpoint, nor from what he calls a movementist standpoint. Has some very interesting conversations about how one of the consequences of May 68 was the birth of how Leninism as a mode was forced into a kind of movementist orientation towards politics in the 1970s. And that's very interesting. Obviously, we're thinking of the alter globalization movement, which began in the early 1990s. And you'll see later, Alain Badiou will frequently critique the alter globalization movement, in part as a movementist, statist structure of politics, as somehow inadequate for that reason. It's a very Lazarus type insight, I think, that Badiou's giving us there. So nonetheless, so people think is the first axiom, and thought is a decision. Thought, and this is where the proletarian component, I think, resides, exists on the side of the people, and that is not just any assemblage of people. Thought, sort of one of the wagers, is that novel thought, or thought that can think in interiority, politically speaking, does reside within marginalized groups, right? And from that, we must gear our attention, right? That I think is clear, right? So it's a heterogeneous scene. There are a number of marginalized groups and so on. So, but, you know, so we need to flag that point. The other thing he says is that we don't really know what the people are, and therefore we sort of have this insistence on a kind of Maoist orientation here. And by that I mean the task of the militant, and in many ways I think this book is a kind of a handbook for militant organizing, is to house oneself amongst the people, right? To identify that. And that I think is where the anthropological piece comes in. So you're doing a workers' anthropology, you're doing an immigrant workers' anthropology, right? Through a kind of Maoist inquiry model. And some of you, I think, are probably familiar with that orientation. It's useful to note that the most successful tactic of Lazarus and Badiou during the post-68 period was actually a rent strike for immigrant laborers that they led. And in the Boncardo article, I recommend you look at that. The second axiom is that thought is a relation of the real. Why is it not to the real? It's not to the real because that would imply a subject-object orientation of thought, a positivist orientation of thought. It would then imply that the people is constituted vis-a-vis, you know, the crisis of political economy, or, you know, some kind of causality which would rely on subject-object. This is not how thought is constituted. Importantly, and this you see in the African thinkers, I mean, it's very interesting that Wamba Diawamba says very clearly, like, you know, the novelty of politics, of emancipatory politics, is not to give a voice to the wretched, right? It's a very Lazarus line, right? Therefore, we're not interested in interrogating the people vis-a-vis representation. We're interested in creating a different mode of epistemological inquiry of groups, of exploitative marginal groups, where he says that what's going to be novel are the identifications that are produced within those assemblages, within those groups, right? What's important is once one is housed within this inquiry process, that one creates an investigation split between thought and politics. And this is a very interesting point because he uses the image of the catamaran and sort of claims that the book must be balanced in this certain way. And thought refers to people think, and thought is a relation of the real, whereas politics refers to sequentiality and the unnamability, right? So we'll get to the theme on the name next time. We're not going to get too much into it, and especially of the real. So I think actually in section 2 next week, we're going to get into the real kind of speculative, meaty aspects of the text. It's already been said before, and I think this bears repeating, that Lazarus is interested in an anthropology that would be non-objectal. And if one arrives at a non-objectal analysis of a group of workers, let's say, what's actually being convoked is a type of invention of the people, right? So there's a certain sense in which people think also implies an existential shift, I would say. And the other thing he mentions in the preface is that history as a category in relationship to politics, and he claims that this is actually an insight of Marx and later of Lenin as well, that the identification of unnameable names of people thinking actually is equivalent to their subtraction from historical time. And that means that it's therefore necessary, in order to do a workers' anthropology, to identify the unique historical sequence that is affecting that group. And here I'm reminded again of the African scholars that have invoked Lazarus and others, where they say, look, it's actually quite important for an emancipatory collective to situate its own understanding of what historical sequence they are being subject to. And here we think, for example, of, I'm even inspired to analyze the way that left populists always insist that the novel historical sequence of our present is this neoliberal sequence. Whereas I believe the Lazarus version of periodization is very, very unique in that sense, because it's actually saying that, as I understand it, and please correct me if you see it differently, that groups very well, people think, very well could be undergoing and identify a sequence that is novel to their own situation, right? And so there is a certain heterogeneity and a kind of very interesting flexibility of how groups come into a sort of identification of their own historical sequence. And of course, he'll later say that the unnameability of the name is such that what's actually happening there is a full subtraction from historical time. So it becomes a very anti-historicist wager. And this kind of links into, obviously, the non-objectal theme. This links into the theme of anti-representation as well. So that's another significant point from the preface. The other important point here is that militants or actors create places, or what Badiou will call sites, within a given mode in which they are operating. And so therefore, from the standpoint of analyzing that, we are introduced to the method of saturation. Now, I believe that this concept of saturation is one of the most interesting in the entire book, in part because, in my view, what saturation sort of represents to me, or what it signals to me, is that historical militants, from the French Revolution to Bolshevik Revolution to whatever site you're examining, are in some sense teetering on the edge of an exhausted mode from which they are looking over one side and looking over the other, almost like you can invoke the image of a precipice, and what Badiou will call the edge of the void, So there is that kind of sense in which political militancy is not afforded by a kind of symbolic. I think that's very important. Lazarus is very opposed to the historicist insistence on symbolic action. Like, for example, that quote from Lenin where the October Revolution had preceded by, I think, a couple of days longer than the French Revolution, and he magically saw the stars align and knew that it was going to be successful. I think the Lazarus model is obviously deeply opposed to this kind of framing of historical. It strikes me as almost a sort of tendency of a kind of historicist teleology. He's very much opposed to that. So saturation is therefore, like I'm giving you this notion of edge of the void, but it's really about examining one's place, their mode, from the standpoint of a prior mode and the surplus of failures of that prior mode. So we can't fully understand revolutionary Leninism until it sort of reaches a point of completion, or until revolutionary Leninism no longer has the efficacy that it had. Can we really see how to then enter into a new mode, right? But there's a certain linkage that's very important there, because one must experiment with the same hypotheses as the prior mode. So this is the method of saturation, which he introduces in the preface. The other thing he introduces here is a strong aversion to statism. And what strikes me about Lazarus's conversation of the state, and I want to hear what others think, is how expansive his critique of statism really is. Because on the one hand, he's talking about all forms of movementist politics, all forms of representational politics. On the other hand, he's sort of making a wider claim that because he has the doctrine that politics is rare and sequential, which is very important, politics is rare and sequential, really the only type of politics that is capable of worth investigating are politics in interiority. Therefore, one can see quite easily the risk one might have of a type of quietism within the Lazarus model of thinking, if you see what I mean. In other words, yes, there is a sort of general field of experimentation, like Marx says in the Communist Manifesto. There are workers' movements, some of which doctrinally or ideologically would not advocate movementist-oriented politics, would not advocate, I don't know, grassroots-oriented politics in this mode, but nonetheless, they are worthwhile to us, if that makes sense. So what I'm trying to say is that there's a strong anti-statism here, and to me, it's almost striking how strong it is, yet how clear the epistemological boundaries are from reproducing statism within politics. So I'll just pause there and see if folks have any thoughts or comments.
Well, I would also, if I could say, interrogate the question of identifications as being an adequate itself approach, because I'm a little concerned about whether we're...
Is this Andrew?
Yeah, Andrew. Hi, it's Andrew. Getting a little close to imaginary discourse. And
So Andrew is a Lacanian, so I had to call you out there. When you say the imaginary, you mean something pretty specific.
Yeah, like ego structure, imaginary phantasms that have a non-dialectical operation, more to do with rivalry between people and groups and self-image. And so I also wonder whether then we're in a slippery slope between identity politics and movement building.
Oh no. As I understand Lazarus, it would be, I mean, one is reminded, speaking in a Lacanian sense, you're probably familiar with this very classic, once Althusser gave Lacan the space to give his seminars, all of a sudden, all of these young Marxists turned up to the seminars, right? And Lacan gave this critique of the sort of 68 spirit by saying, well, effectively what Andrew is saying, that this really is, not only is it secretly desiring a new master, everybody knows that quote, but what else is going on is specular misrecognition, right? There's a kind of kind of, you're caught within the kind of Kojevian battle for prestige or something like this.
Exactly.
Right?
Recognize me.
Yeah. So I think Lazarus very clearly is not advocating a form of thinking the subject. He wants to detether from this, yeah? And so I think that's clear to me. I don't know if anyone else wishes to sort of make a, and I think Lacan is a master name or a kind of proper name, which will be important for us, especially as we look at the real. Andrew, I don't think this is sort of, what's going on.
Okay, one last other little comment, sort of Lacanian thing, just to clarify, and maybe we'll get to it. What does he mean by the real? Is it a real in the Lacanian sense?
So he means by the real as the there is within a situation, And is it a Lacanian? When Gabriel gives his presentation next week, I want Gabriel to sort of help us unpack that, because when he presents, he's going to be very much on that thing. And as Gabriel often does, he gives very nice definitions and presentations.
Good question. I got a question.
Please.
Hey, I'm Jerome. I'm curious about, okay, so it's clear that it's not a historicist project, but there are historical modes of politics.
Right.
And it's clear that those historical modes of politics, you can identify them by virtue of the categories being saturated or over time no longer useful. And you can see that by way of the places themselves lapsing. Okay, so that's how I interpret all of, in the kind of Cliff Notes version of how I interpret these first few chapters. But I'm curious then, okay, so there's certainly kind of a historical limits or temporal limits maybe to certain historical modes of politics, but is there also spatial limits or, I just asked that because the Bolshevik mode of politics, for instance, does that encompass the entire planet? Does that encompass politics everywhere or, and that might be a really corny question. I apologize about that.
No, sure.
But I'm only thinking about that because it's confusing to me how we're supposed to square the historical modes of politics thesis with the thinking thoughts as inquiry or workers' inquiry and the identifications wrought from workers or people articulating their own identifications with, say, political categories or what have you. How we're supposed to square these two things. One seems very particular, and one seems you can not generalizable. I mean, he himself is I don't like that word, but okay, that's all I got.
Yeah, right. Because on the one hand, you have the failure of movementist politics, and one of the indications that Leninism had saturated was that it became reliant on the state. And when politics becomes reliant on the state, it must think of itself through what Lazarus will call the totality. So here we're introduced back to this kind of Lukácsian category of the totality. This is not something Lazarus is interested in at all. This is what he says Marcel Mao discovered was that the crystallization of the totality, this kind of what Michael Heinrich calls worldview Marxism, right? Which Lukács was the last great philosopher of, is impossible. He says in the preface, Marcel Mao shows us anthropologically that the subjective cannot be thought on its own basis. Names, therefore, are just one instance of the totality, right? And so what I would love for us to do is to sort of unpack that deeper philosophical, background into this unnameability of the name. Why is it that names ultimately reach this kind of zeroing out of unnameability? As to this question of is Bolshevism a global universal? Badiou gives us a trans-historical theory of universalism through what he calls the subject of resurrection. But it is trans-historical, right? It is still only affecting subjects within the world in which its effects are known and felt and so on. And I know many of the people on this call actually have kind of done a lot of work on the late Badiou, who really kind of delves into these questions. And one would have to make a distinction here in a Badiouian sense between the kind of state of the situation and evental sites, which we can do at some point. So I'm not quite sure that he's making that claim. I know for a fact he's not saying that per se about a global theory of history. But Jerome, that's super useful.
Quick question, another one, quick.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So fair. Also, I feel like we get like a good take on as to what sequentiality is in the preface. I'm not sure if we're moving on or what have you.
Please.
I'm not sure if we get as much of a clear articulation of what like the rarity qualifier is supposed to mean. And that's all I got.
Right. That's an interesting point, which is why is the rarity theme like what's rare? that workers identify the unnameability of the name that they kind of like, and then what are the conditions of that rarity, right? Because I think that it's very much a shame in kind of Anglo-American reception of Alain Badiou. It largely came through theology departments, through his book on St. Paul, which is a very terrible book in the sense that it led to a lot of people think that, oh, you know, the event is grace, or the event is from outside, or the event is this kind of quasi-magical thing. And then it led even more people to think that, politically speaking, Badiouian politics is this kind of patient wait and see on the sidelines, as opposed to a sort of more active, more practical, more engaged form of politics. And as a Badiouian, I really like Lazarus for that reason, because he's giving us clearly the handbook, you know, the practical stuff to sort of engage. So I want to return quickly to the theme of saturation, which he introduces in the preface, which is that, again, evoking this kind of edge of the void theme, a saturated mode is observable, he says, subjectively, in that it no longer has subjective efficacy. This means that with the factory and the worker, we are dealing with sites in interiority. So my question would be then, when you have a mode, which the subject of the worker, let's say in the Leninist period of struggle, were those workers still seeing their situation as in interiority? Or rather, does in interiority only come at the end? This is actually a question that I think we may resolve later, but it was something that came up for me. You see my point? Like, something about the novelty of the prior mode can only be realized when its efficacy fails, right? So there's that fascinating connectivity between two modes. I don't know if anybody has a comment on that before I move on.
Can I suggest that in the chat, both Brian and Robin have chimed in?
Oh yeah.
If they can.
Please. Robin, would you mind jumping in? And
sure. I mean, I'm just trying not to interrupt the discussion, but also I have, you know, so many thoughts and responses to these rich set of comments. The sort of two things that I mentioned in the chat are maybe themes that we've moved on from, but which were very interesting to me. One is the theme of anthropology and its status here, and the other is this argument, the sort of profound and profoundly interesting anti-statism. So on the sort of theme of anthropology, for me, it was quite interesting that Lazarus insists upon politics of separation from many disciplines, which in the sort of, especially in the sort of Anglo-American tradition, it might be sort of conflated with, right? So he's going to insist upon politics of separation from history, from economics, from sociology, right? But at the same time, argue for a certain kind of fusion with anthropology, right? Which he describes in the preface as, quote, a disciplinary horizon that is potentially capable of welcoming, accepting, and grasping the subjective, right? So this, I thought this was really interesting, especially in how he reads the innovations of Marx and Lenin, right? The innovations of Marx are to introduce the separation between politics and philosophy, right? That goes under the rubric of classism. The innovation of Lenin is to introduce the separation between politics and history, right? And so my sort of question was, like, is there a mode of politics that might insist upon its separation from anthropology, right? Or if not, is this entire effort at separation, right, which might in another discourse be understood as sort of establishing the so-called autonomy of the political, right? Like, is that effort like misguided in some fundamental way, right? I mean, I sort of appreciate why he's doing it, and especially in the reading of Lenin, the payoff was real. And then I either wanted it to be followed through in politics' own insistence upon its separation from anthropology as a limited disciplinary horizon, or I in some sense wanted a sort of re-dialectics, right, to sort of follow the de-dialectics that were given. The issue on maybe on the point about the anti-statism, for me, I also quite loved it. I was like provoked by it. I do though wonder, right, sort of the way that he talks about thought is in terms of the order of thought, right? Oftentimes order of is the term that we get before thought. So I'm thinking very specifically on the first page of the introduction, right, where he argues that politics is either in the space of the state or it is the order of thought. And I'm just, I mean, right, so it seems to me that order is its own kind of, it carries the residues of a statism, if I'm going to put it like some way, right? It seems to me that the risk here is a certain kind of a kind of epistemological argument that retains the residues of statism, in that thought itself appears as an order, and perhaps even as an ordering instrument in some way, or as a kind of ordering potentiality, right? So when he talks about the prescriptive and so forth, right? I mean, there is like the potentially quite utopian and interesting an affirmative gloss on the prescriptive. There is another way of thinking about the prescriptive, especially when the language of order is retained as the prominent feature of thought, that makes it seem much less utopian to me, and actually sort of rings with a certain kind of statism. So those are like two of, I don't know, these are like sort of half-baked thoughts in response to the really important issues that you and the other commentators have brought up with respect to anthropology and the anti-statism and the sort of genuine innovations of this approach.
Yeah, it's really beautiful. I don't know if I want to invite others to respond.
Daniel, do you mind if I jump in?
Go ahead.
Real quick. Yeah, I just had one thought adding on to, because I really liked those two questions.
Sure.
It seemed like part of what those questions were doing is asking about like the relationship between sort of the anthropology part of this project, like the workers' inquiry part of this project, and like this other part. And so I was thinking about like Lazarus has this great essay about like the kind of workers' inquiry method, and there's this kind of like beautiful case study in there that's of it's like mid-70s France. There's these immigrants that are potentially being like laid off or not getting benefits from a factory where they're working, and there's these workers that come together on under the prescription that it is not the bosses who count who we are, it is workers who count who workers are. So this is the sort of like site that Lazarus has in mind when he's talking about where politics is happening, is in that prescription. It is not the bosses who count who we are. It is the workers who count the workers. So like, why is this interesting at the level of like people think? They're using this language of workers and stuff like this, but they're using it for a very different end, because there's this sense that the workers are being counted in some particular way by their bosses. People, what's interesting about it as a term is that it's like a certain indeterminate, is what Lazarus says about it over and over again. It's not even the people, it's just people. Right. The people is already too determinate. It's those people over there, over here, or whatever. Yeah. And so when the workers are saying it is the workers who count the workers, what they are saying is, they're on one level, they're pragmatically appealing for a set of benefits for themselves and for the people, their comrades, and who they're working for. But at another level, what they're saying is that people think that you do not, you actually don't count on behalf of us who we are, that we count ourselves for ourselves. And so that's like one of those points where you see kind of the combination, and that's why it'd be a site that'd be worth inquiring back into. You go back to those names as they're happening in that site, and you learn from there that that's a specific place where people think, that sort of thing.
Yeah, no, that's really useful. Thank you, Brian and Robin. I don't know if anyone else wanted to jump in. I wanted to also.
Yeah, Daniel, do you mind if I jump in with a few quick comments?
Please.
Regarding Robin's wonderful questions. Yeah. Firstly, I think about the use of anthropology. Just a quick reference. It's interesting to know that Kant already used, I think, anthropology from a pragmatic point of view in a very different way than the disciplinary way that we kind of use anthropology today. And I think maybe Lazarus, not specifically relating his work to Kant, but maybe there is a use of anthropology, which Badiou also later, of course, also picks up on, which is almost like ontological in the sense that people are there. There are beings there, and yeah, they think. And not only that they do things as opposed to the statist mode of doing and undoing, but rather they think. And I think this is quite striking in Lazarus's kind of direction of politics as opposed to the political, from action to thought, really. And this brings me maybe just another kind of a thought about the concept of thought, which may be used in Lazarus's book almost, I mean, it brings almost the connotation of an idea, of course, with a Platonic capital I. And I think once we maybe change the terms, it makes more sense why like people have ideas in this big capital I sense, which then leads to the creation of a new politics. And just a second point about the order and the question of the identification of the order and the state, which brings the question of the outside of the state. Like, can we even be outside of the state? I think Badiou is really clear on that, how he used subtraction in order to create the outside of the space, right? Removing ourselves from the order of the state in a way which I think does manage to be outside of the state. So I wouldn't conflate entirely the order and the possibility of having some sort of an outside to it. Yeah. And what is lastly, what is paradoxical about this possibility of discerning the outside of the state is precisely by going through the indiscernible, right? Or as a way to the unnameable name. And I just want to bring kind of a short reminder that the interior, which we all talk about a lot, I think is quite rigidly defined in Badiou's terms, and is simply the set itself. Almost the interior of a set is the set itself, or the part of the set. So there is no interior essential interiority, which maybe brings us back to the consciousness and all this kind of imaginary realm, but rather, as with relation to the real, it's something which is simply thought of as itself, and not as something derivative of or something else. So be it sociological, economic, even historical. So these were my 2
Very nice,
points.
very nice, very nice. Excellent. I suddenly realized that we may have a hard time getting through chapter 1. But nonetheless, yeah, picking up off of all of those brilliant comments, and I must say, it's very nice to see some of you who have been social media friends for many years and now finally get to see you. That's nice. So let me just continue with my sort of summary here. Okay, so in the introduction, Lazarus says very clearly that the subjective without a dialectics is a thought. If politics is thinkable, then it is not an object. So therefore, the thinkability of politics is a breakdown of the subject-object relation. On the one hand. On the other hand, that thought is actually delivering something that is ungraspable subjectively, but which emerges within, somebody said spaces, you know, within a place, right? So if the name of Leninism, one of the most important names, is the party, you can apply the party form precisely to that, as the party form had instantiations across various places, and those instantiations had a certain efficacy, which meant that subjects there were thinking with an efficacious form there, as I read it. The other point he makes, a distinction that's very important in the introduction, which will stay with us, is between heterogeneity and homogeneity, because it's only within a homogeneous collective that you have the creation of a point of unnamability, and then the creation of places from that. But within a heterogeneous assemblage, you have what he calls polysemy. So you have an inevitable multiplicity of meanings and so on. So you still have, obviously, a multiplicity within a homogeneous, but one of the questions is, how does unnamability appear, right? And this I think is a very significant question that he, so anyways, let us move to chapter 1. He begins by basically charting out the Caesura of 68, and notices that what was composed in its wake was what he calls a ideologism, composed of thought on the one hand, the thought of politics and practice. And this is a perfect example of a situation which was heterogeneous. In other words, which was not prescriptive, right? This created the conditions for an experience of politics which was not lending itself to the prescriptive. The only logic during this time, which the ideologism of Leninism could respond to, were revolts. And revolts ultimately were inadequate in Lazarus's view, because they circulated names which ultimately were reliant on statism. In other words, there was a sort of realization that Leninism was somehow bound to remain within the matrices of a kind of capitalist parliamentarism. This is something, by the way, which Badiou had recognized within the Soviet Communist Party, within the Communist Party within France, that there effectively were reproducing multiple bourgeoisies within them, for example. So he says that in the revolt, they took the name of anti-capitalism, but in some sense they stayed within the time of capital, and therefore were not sort of fully capable of entering into the prescriptive. And what you get from ideologism is two important features. One he calls theoreticism, and the other he calls activism. And theoreticism is basically a form of politics which was trying to tether its logic to, let's say, the crisis of political economy, or to some thesis about class unity, or something like this. In other words, it would be very much reliant on a dialectics of subject and object, very much reliant on a scientific orientation. The other tendency, activism, was sort of obsessed purely with practice as such. And ideologism ultimately, he says on page 17, that the organizational, quote, I'm quoting, is manifestly forced to be distributed partly in thought and partly in practice. Thus, it is split and enters into the heterogeneous. And here he's locating two efforts, one Trotskyist and the other a kind of appendage Marxist-Leninist effort, not his own, but another one. And he basically wishes to claim that there was something about the wider mode of Leninism during that time which prevented the seizure of their objectives. Their objectives were somehow went unmet, and they sort of inevitably oscillated into what he calls movement-ism. And movement-ism came about to focus on a kind of post-party configuration of politics. And Lazarus himself actually did this. What was movement-ism? Movement-ism was basically recognizing that you have a kind of fractured or fragmented proletariat in relationship to the party form. And so one must actually adopt very experimental inquiries into factories, into schools, into this immigrant group, and so on. And the movements themselves, organized under a kind of ideology or a critique of ideology, and produce what he calls a historicist ideologism. And really, it was the historicist ideologism for Lazarus, which I think indicated the profound immobility of the Leninist project more generally. He says that they relied way too much on the logic of the revolt. Here I'm reminded of a thinker like Joshua Clover in our own time, who in his text, Riot, Strike, Riot, very much introduces a similar sort of notion that historical periodization should be punctuated by this sort of quasi-spontaneous revolts, right? These are sort of unorganized instantiations or eruptions of revolutionary activity, which are always generally anti-capitalist, but for which there is something which is not able to be produced within the realm of thought. They still remain somehow tethered to a frustrated relationship to the state, is my reading of Lazarus here, and I would love other thoughts on that. So he says on page 21 that the end of movementism beckons the introduction of a new term, which is basically the state. And he says, in order to transition to the whole, the state became necessary in parliamentary politics, just as in movement politics, because they remain posited in exteriority. So he is basically now saying, look, all of movementist and the whole logic that's undergirding it, experimenting outside of the party form and so on, has now been seized by a form of statism because of the way it is conceiving of its dialectical place. That's all very interesting. The next section, and for the purpose of time, I do want to kind of move through this a little bit so we create some movement, unless there's any questions in the chat that are worth commenting on.
May I ask something?
Please.
I was wondering, I mean, you established the political consequences of ideologism, but I heard you say that they stemmed from this relationship between, it was the fusion of practice and thought of politics. Whereas I actually thought the source of it was the fusion of the thought of politics and of thought in general. As in, it was this tendency to have some kind of general framework of notions that would function both as concepts within political practice and as scientific notions. And that would actually be the kind of the source of those problems. And I related it more to this tendency that that you get in a lot of the followers of Deleuze, to see this, to kind of refuse to see or to think philosophy in its own terms and think of it in terms of what is more aesthetically or politically preferable. And I think Lazarus is pointing out the kind of inverse thing, which is a refusal to kind of to consider politics on its own terms as well, as in to apply to it the concepts that belong to the sciences. And I think that was the point that Robin was trying to make about the autonomy of the political.
Yeah, that's excellent. No, I think you're right. As I understand it, what he critiques of the reliance on a ideology by ideologism was a general exhaustion of various experimental modes of revolutionary tactics, strategies, activity, under the broad umbrella of a commitment to revolutionary Leninism. And he identifies the Trotskyist technique, he identifies different orientations. And I think one of the big questions I would actually want to pose, and as I understand it, is we can't really examine the way in which they failed until we are able to treat them from the category of what he calls intellectuality, right? In other words, there's an epistemological move that he makes, a shift, through the method of saturation, that he's giving us a very useful way to assess our prior political experimentations, right? He's giving us, when he begins the whole section called Reassessing Leninism and the Method of Saturation on around 24, 25, I think he's actually giving us a sort of way, not necessarily to do a retrospective, because that would be too isolated, but part of the beauty of what his method is allowing us to do is to recognize that the insights we have epistemologically into how we failed before produce novelties for our present, right? And that's how you introduce this whole notion of lapsing, right? Identifying the lapsing aspect of a category is very, very important. Once you've identified where the lapsing has taken place within a mode, you're then able to look at that mode more objectively. You're able to do sort of intellectuality on it. Any other, I cannot read the chat and sort of improvise my thinking. I apologize. So if there are things in the chat which must be said, please say them while I speak. It's totally good to interrupt me. So
I wonder if it's
please.
worthwhile to take a breather and just see what we've accumulated that people are trying to make sense of. I'm just, especially people who are approaching this text for the first time, I'm sort of curious what's, I don't mean to disrupt the progression, but I'm wondering, because there's been a lot.
There has been a lot, yeah. Please, that's a good point. Let's take a break and see where people are at. I'm going to read the chat as well. I do have an interest in sort of pushing through so that we maintain, but nonetheless, okay.
I have a quick kind of question about the kind of other movements that were around at the time and the sort of cut that Lazarus and I assume kind of the Jew make, because obviously the kind of practice that they were involved in after May 68 is one that many other groups were also experimenting with, the kind of établi, the sort of workers' inquiry and so on. So there's a kind of precursor, which is the group Socialism ou Barbarie, and which had actually kind of dissolved in '67. But I just kind of wonder why, so whether there's any reference to that as a kind of learning experience or that kind of trajectory. It seems that Lazarus, through this kind of periodization, is mostly talking about groups that had a kind of Leninist orientation, whereas which many groups switch in '68 away from a Leninist orientation, that there are these other groups prior to 68 who already had kind of been on a different trajectory. So I wonder what, to me, it seems as a dialogue, a sort of a silent dialogue in a way with those tendencies.
It's a very nice point. And I think on page, 28, 29, what he's doing is two things. He's giving us a method for how to examine the exhaustion of a particular mode, the inefficacy within a particular mode, on the one hand. On the other hand, so he's giving a kind of a schemata, right? On the other hand, he is giving us a very clear interrogation of largely the French Marxist left committed to the Leninist project, right? Largely. So yes, and I think it's quite interesting because, the result is that there's not many people that are doing it right. I mean, it's a highly critical appraisal, nonetheless, right? And you can see that he goes into quite some detail on the shortcomings. But if we sort of, probably for our purposes, since we are sort of approaching this from a theoretical point of view, it may be more useful for us to subtract from the on the ground, historical examples, and to sort of remain at this meta level as well. Other thoughts and comments or questions? Unmute.
Can't hear you, Chris.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I had a question comment about ideologism, because it seems that, I'm new to, I've met Lazarus, but this is the first time I've read him, and we've talked, but it seems this is a very useful concept, and this is a very useful way to think about blockages and stoppages in the field of the political. So I hope that we can get, we can really get at a common and solid understanding of how ideologism works. It seems like what we have here, and it's important to be, the way he begins the discussion is that it arises in opposition to the French Communist Party. It's an anti-communist party formation, and then in this typology of ideologism shows the various ways in which this saturation, which we've been talking about till now, sort of gets achieved. It seems to me that ideologism is a mode of saturation, and so there's a varied typology of ideologism, but I wonder if we can generalize, as you say, maybe on the theoretical level of how to recognize it and how to evaluate it as a tendency. It seems to me that maybe a useful way to think about it would be ideologism as the opposite of separation. The separation that is politics, and that is that allows for the homogeneity of the political. I mean, ideologism is a sort of structural, it's an apparatus for the heterogeneous. But I think in our, as we're sort of thinking in this interregnum period of politics and an activation of politics, maybe a clear understanding of ideologism would be useful for us.
I think it's really great. Is that Chris?
Yeah, Chris, yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that beautiful comment, and we'd love to learn about your experience meeting Lazarus in the flesh. I will return to what I think is most important, which is that there were floating names. There was no subjectivist subtraction within ideologism, which goes back to the notion of exhaustion of the mode of Leninism, because what that means is that the various sites, okay, sure, there's specific critiques of the French Communist Party, and there's this party and that, but if we think about it more abstractly, overall, it had to produce what he calls on page 19, on page 2021, a totality. So because it remained in exteriority, it relied on, at the end of the day, through its failures, the creation of what he calls a totality, right? And then became subsumed back into politics in exteriority. So the notion of movementism was maybe fine while it was happening, but at the end of its sequence, sort of, there was a point at which using the circulation of antagonistic names through the logic of the revolt, it's almost as if the movement-ism was unable to sort of seize a subtractive moment. That's how I would say it. I invite others to sort of.
Or maybe originarily it was not subtractive enough, that movement-ism, by positing a kind of continuity between theory and practice, already, violated the sort of, the separation, the postulate of separation.
Can you say more about that?
Well, it doesn't seem that movement-ism had its sort of moment of the political. That movement-ism was he seems to describe it, and I might be getting this wrong, as being predicated on already this sort of theory practice continuum, and that was its historical error.
Right. He says.
I mean, in other words, that was the way out of perceived blockage, the perceived blockage of the PCF, but it led into its own sort of saturation.
So was the problem then? How do we locate the problem? How do we pinpoint the problem? Because, like you said just now, very helpfully, there was a separation between what he says, politics and practice. But there was something inadequate. What was inadequate about that?
Maybe the non-thinking of the political, or the absence of a thought of the political, because of the prior heterogeneity that gets established. It's a good question. Good. I'm not sure how to answer that. Yeah.
So we're looking about 19 to page 21 in that range. We're looking at that right now. Other thoughts are welcome.
On page 17 at the end of, he gives the examples of Trotskyism and Maoism essentially, and he specifies each of them. But then he says, in general, for these groups, the question of organization is thus related to a general theory, which is that of Leninism, while the practical dimension feeds the new historicity and is deployed in activism, in committees, and in what will be their end, in movements. And so the thought and practice split of ideologism is one which leads organization to be relegated to a general theory, in which Leninism is just the invariant general form, while then practice takes on the specific historical form, which leads into movements. Whereas the alternative that he appears to be pointing to is one, if politics is thought, rather than being divisible into theory and practice, then we have to understand how thought is assigned to particular modes which have particular kinds of organization, rather than this division. Hence the idea of historical modes of politics which emerge and then get saturated. And I would just add, I just think, in terms of the method from the outset, we've talked a bit about interiority and homogeneity and so on. And I just want to underscore the extent to which it's announced straight from the beginning that the fundamental aim of the text is the thinking of the subjective, and thinking of the subjective at the level of the subjective, rather than through reference to something else. Hence homogeneity, which seems, we're accustomed in theory to heterogeneity being a good thing and so on. But homogeneity meaning that subjectivity is understood in terms of itself rather than referring it to an external foundation, which would be, for example, class. So class would be precisely one such way of thinking the subjective with reference to an external object. And so yeah, I think this would be the distance from the groups like socialism or barbarism, which ultimately had a classist problematic, perhaps.
Thank you for that intervention, Assad. Other thoughts? I do want to move, with about 15 minutes left for today, I want to move to the next section on reassessing Leninism, because here he really develops the method of saturation in more detail. But before we move on, I want to invite other thoughts. This is really great, by the way, everybody. It's really nice in quarantine to immerse yourself in a text like this and sort of be in interiority with you.
Daniel, I have a quick question.
Yeah. By all means.
A really quick question about maybe a possible correlation between the, I want to jump back to Chris's discussion about the separation and how it's fruitful politics, particularly, versus the ideologism of putting them together, the thought of politics and practice. And I'm just wondering, didn't Badiou say something quite similar when it comes to ideology as trying to, if I'm not mistaken, put together the four truth procedures in a way that kind of influence one another, which is the ideology? As if, for example, we should be enacting this or that kind of politics because science or political science tells us this much. And I think but you mentioned this somewhere, that the noting of the four truth procedures is in a sense almost the definition of ideology, if I'm not mistaken. And I see some correlation there between the tying, the ideologism that Lazarus is talking about, while tying together the thought of politics and practice, as opposed to separating them.
So that's interesting. Yeah. So you're talking about Badiou's four conditions, and there might be a linkage there. I think that the concept is what Badiou refers to as the spaces of compossibility between or across conditions. So there's a lot of overlap, and I think that's quite nice. And I think when one reads Alain Badiou's politics, it is as if one is reading Lazarus. The terms are sort of incidental. But nonetheless, that's very helpful. All right. So he says that, to summarize, we've reached a saturated point with Leninism, yet there is a point of excess. And epistemologically, let's latch on to that point of excess. There is something which remains, something that is worth experimenting from it. And what is that? It is the status of the worker. And we begin our method of saturation, and I think he's very much decided on that there is sort of within all of those examples we just looked at, it seems that one of the big insights is that the party form is no longer a site of efficacy, of novelty, etc. Yet, nonetheless, workers remain. And so the workers' anthropology, in some sense, can be kind of located there, just as a background. So he says on page 25 that saturation is a method of identifying the lapsing of a category within a sequence so as to produce a new conjecture, or so as to see a new conjecture. So again, this kind of image of precipice or edge of void is, I think, quite relevant. It's also interesting to think of sort of the reader, like who are we as readers, both as committed to emancipatory politics, as militants, but also sort of, you see my point, sort of, are we anthropologists here a little bit? Are we also militants committed to a certain program of a politics under the communist hypothesis of non-domination and the possibility of non-domination social life? Yet we are also historians, right? We are also seeking to identify some site of break or rupture. Right? I love that. I think this is super central. And when we're doing this, we are able to see what was from the standpoint of what he calls intellectuality. And he says that one of the major problems of the historians that he relies on for this, and Foucault, as you saw in the preface, is a name which is not forgotten on him, even though it's not invoked. So he's very much a reader of the Annales school, of Bloch, one should reference here when thinking about Lazarus's theory of history, all of Badiou's early work on history as a communist invariant, and all of Badiou's work in theory of the subject on periodization as well. So all of this is decades of a kind of refinement of thinking about history. But what I like about this is that he's bringing it to the practical level, you see? So the question is, how does one look at a mode and identify its terms, its sites, its names from the standpoint of intellectuality? That's kind of the objective in some sense. Here's a difficult passage I want to raise with you on 28, which is, okay. If we are to avoid pushing politics into the arena of history and of the state, we must acknowledge that the multiplicity of intellectualities is not a multiplicity of historicities. The example that is striking here is the worker figure under the period of Leninism. So in other words, he's introducing, unfortunately, a series of new terms and new critiques of these very terms. So you have a multiplicity of historicities, and you have a multiplicities of intellectualities. But if we are to avoid pushing politics into the arena of history and the state, we must acknowledge them. So what does he mean by this? How do we avoid pushing politics into the objectal, ultimately, into the representational, which is history and the state? Because while he is interested, okay, in a historian's eye on all of this, by no means is he wanting to derive the subjective from within history proper. That's a very novel point, and I think that's actually something, thankfully, for next time we're going to be looking at pretty deeply. It's a paradox. It's a paradox because how do you identify the subjective as a break from history, right? We know in Badiou that the category of time is a negative category, always has been. We know that the subject seizes time, right? Somehow overcomes time. And so Lazarus will be following in that same kind of vein. So we have some points on the chat before I move on. Oh, nothing, okay. So he continues to say that for Lenin, the party remained the name of the Bolshevik mode. And it is striking that the site of the party had all of these various instantiations across various scenes, states, nations, places, etc. And I want to reference the point, and this is very important, I think, the point at which the party form became a clearly exhausted mode, and in which we could view it from the standpoint of what Lazarus calls intellectuality. And I believe that this comes in the early 1980s, specifically in the Polish workers' movement called Solidarity. Those familiar with Badiou's lecture, Can Politics Be Thought?, identifies this as the point of saturation of the Leninist party mode, but also of the saturation of the workers' movement globally. Why do I say that? Well, it's because if you're familiar with this, and I'm only briefly familiar with it, having seen it from Badiou's reference, it was a liberal-driven workers' movement which formulated its own subjectivization, like the impulses which motivated it, precisely in opposition to the truths of the Leninist party form, yet still saw itself as workerist, as a workers' movement. And it's very kind of striking, almost a kind of tragic figure. So it was at that point that a clear excess point of the category of workers' movement had to be introduced. So that's a little background. I think that's useful. And Robin makes a point in the chat. Can you say that out loud, please?
Sure. I just wanted to think about this method of saturation,
Please.
which I think is so rich and very interesting, and it seems to me that one of the many things that's interesting about it. I mean, I have questions about modes and how we sort of, how modes become saturated, and then that sort of linchpin that might join it or connect it to a next mode. But for me, what's interesting is that there's this, for me, it's about thinking about what the method of saturation is intended to avoid, right? And he identifies a few things that this method is intended to avoid. First, it's intended to avoid a kind of disavowal, right, especially of Leninism, right? But also what he describes as the doctrine of failure, right? Or this kind of crushing sense of defeat, right? This kind of a reconstruction of history as simply the history of failure and defeat. So it seems to me that there is like a kind of argument here for thought and the primacy of thought, which also, and maybe even primarily, intends to work on the level of passion and affect, right? That it in some sense is to generate a set of a certain kind of affective orientation to politics, and to sort of previous modes of politics. And so the method of saturation has sort of affective implications, right? If we take this kind of overwhelming sense of failure and disappointment, or a politics of disavowal, to be bound up not only with a kind of epistemological perspective, but also an affective orientation to history, that for me, what's interesting is the kind of unstated affects in the method of saturation.
I love that. And here we're almost reminded of an ethics of Lazarus, I would say. It's a sort of very reminiscent of Badiou's concluding chapter of Theory of the Subject, which Rob Boncardo helped me realize something about that text, which I had never realized before, which was Badiou was creating a ethics for militants breaking the law. And he was saying, okay, you break the law and you feel anxiety, and you have a corresponding affect to courage. And sort of you can formally map this, right? But the very interesting point is, yes, there is an ethical and yes, affective residue or excess of shame, of defeat, and so on. And all of the kind of French rationalism, this Cartesianism of thought, has an affective component. I think that's such a lovely sentiment.
There are interesting points in the chat that Brian has pointed to the affective enthusiasm as being fundamental in Lazarus's elaboration, but also in the dialectical mode of politics, which is characterized by enthusiasm for socialism. I don't know if you want to say more about that, Brian, but also I thought Jerome had a good question.
I'll just post a little thing in the chat.
And of course, he opens the book in the preface, right, saying this book, Anthropology of the Name, was created as an enthusiastic effort. And of course, Badiou has that whole thing in Logics of Worlds, where the name of politics of equality is associated with the affect of enthusiasm. So very, very nice, very nice. And then Duncan, it's nice to see you. And Duncan, I know you've read this text before. Did you have a comment as well?
Not really. I'm just about as confused as everyone else. I have read the book before. So, yeah, there you go. There's my comment.
Well, it's nice to hear your voice, and thank you. So continuing on in my summary here, well, actually, we have reached the 6 p.m. mark. Let me ask a check-in. I know it's Saturday and people have family and probably red wine to drink. At least I hope you do. Shall we continue on for 10 more minutes to sort of finish this method of saturation? Stay on. If not, you can bounce. It will be recorded and we'll share it on Slack or whatever.
I have a quick question that maybe we could just postpone for next week. And I wrote it in the chat. It was just basically like how, there's like the difference between the taking place and having took place. There's like notions of saturation and lapsing and all this stuff. And my basic question is like, how is anyone supposed to identify when lapsing of the sites of historical modes of politics? Because that's what he says. He's like, it's the sites, when the sites are lapsing. So you explained what the party situation in Poland and whatnot. Like, how are we supposed to identify when lapsing is occurring or has even occurred? Like, what actually does one look for? Or, I know maybe looking at, right, consciousness of, maybe that's not it. I don't know. I'm just kind of curious about like, how are you even supposed to like say that something has lapsed, to be honest?
Right. Right.
If I could add something to that as well, I don't know if this is just too impatient or not, but I'm wondering, I'm really eager to understand the practical implications of this. And again, maybe that's just me being impatient and needing to wait to understand this further, but I'm curious if anyone else has that question as well.
Hey,
I think right now, I have a thought.
Daniel, by all means.
And yes, I am Daniel, a different Daniel. I've been looking over at a passage on the 30th page where he describes the mode of intellectuality as the thought of the thought in the effectiveness of the mode. And then that's opposed to a mode of historicity, which is where you're thinking this historical mode as something that is done. And so I'm seeing right here very clearly a kind of historiographical practice, that this is the way that you respond to the thing that is done. I am not seeing right now a way that this immediately responds to a historical actor living in a moment that might or might not be ended.
Right. In other words, we go hypothetically to a factory, we perform a workers' anthropology. That group begins to sort of nominate certain names of their own oppression, of their own experimentation. We start to identify what's possible to rupture within that situation. As I understand your point, sort of, at what point must those workers become quasi-historians or something like? What do you mean?
Yes, I suppose it. I guess it's that I'm seeing two separate subjectivities.
Yes.
Taking place here: the subjectivity of the historian looking back, and then the subjectivity of I suppose one question I have is the method of saturation a thing that happens, or is it something that the historian does?
Right.
But
Go ahead, please.
Just to sort of, yeah.
I don't think the historian.
I feel like.
Go for it.
Oh, Brian. No, I think like this question of historicity, but then I think that needs to sort of be fed back into the kind of category of thought, right? Because like the type of historicity that he's talking about is not the objective historicity that we might like look for if we were, practicing some kind of, writing of history, right? What he really seems to be trying to account for is some kind of thought that is not of something else, but which is like in relation to kind of this caesura, right? That he begins with speaking about. So I mean,
so
to that question,
remember,
like, what is
remember,
it like
I think,
scansion, that discourse of scansion that he brings?
well, I think the important thing here, just to be precise, is that the objective of saturation is what? He says very clearly it is to grasp the prescriptive crystallization. To grasp the prescriptive crystallization. We know, we have a vague idea of the conditions for the creation of a prescriptive possibility, yeah? So I think, to answer Danny's point, it seems to me that maybe there are kind of two modes of inquiry. There is a kind of, and maybe this is an inherent question of the thinker versus the worker. I would never want to, I'm very sort of sensitive to this distinction, and I wonder if it exists. So obviously we have this within Maoism, we have this within Leninism. So maybe what Danny is evoking is sort of, what are the various kind of subjective roles one takes for the location of a prescriptive crystallization, right? And a prescriptive crystallization is what remains intact in the places of the name, right? So it's not the name itself. The name is unnameable, but the prescriptive crystallization is what remains efficacious within the place that is produced as an effect of the unnameability of the name. Sorry, that's a lot. I apologize. And of course, the other point I would say is that it's something you achieve. It's saturation is something that you achieve, and it is something which links an old mode to a new mode, an exhausted mode to a mode in fruition or something like that, right? It keeps the prior mode alive. It keeps the figure of the worker efficacious. So anyways, everyone's now awfully quiet. I insist that you jump in and harass everyone.
I have a bit of harassment, a second bit. Just you mentioning the linkages between the different modes of political action or of historicization. One of the moments I found most fascinating in this chapter was when he articulates a kind of secondary reason, it seems, to not let the historical moments be separated off, which is at the moment you let that happen, when you let there be the specific name for, yes, this was the French Revolution, that thing that is done, this was the commune in this part of the world, and that is done, is that now you can start comparing them. And then you get to, I was thinking of this when Robin mentioned utopians, then you can start thinking about this as different possible models for what kind of state or revolt that we want to have, and you can start ranking them. And then you can just say, well, we just need to do this one. And don't worry about the other ones.
Right, and back to this point, I think it's actually foolish to make a dichotomy between a thinker, a reader, and a worker. This is foolish because clearly the first page of the book says that thought happens out there. The thought is something which is in process. People think. So I'm not committed to that distinction, although I appreciate the kind of hermeneutics of suspicion, let's call it. That's number one. I think the other point, as you said, is that Leninism had a few sides, right? It had multiple names, right? The party is abandoned after the early 80s, right? But the worker is what remains, right? So there is a kind of epistemological decision which is informed by experimental work using worker anthropology, right? Right? So there are decisions made there in the method of saturation, I would say.
Can I just butt in quickly?
Please.
I mean, with the questions of, there's like a few people have been asking about like, I think there was someone who was like talking about how they're being impatient, and they're like, what's the point of this? And these questions about like how we can know if a mode is lapsing and these things. I think one of the tricky things here is that if you want to take Lazarus seriously about like the idea that people think, then one way to put this is that people don't need to read his book to do politics. So otherwise, we would immediately run into a problem, or maybe a paradox, definitely a problem. And so I think we need to be careful about thinking about like, and this is certainly my view, and this is obviously challengeable, but my sense is we have to be careful about thinking about what the purpose of this book is, and like what the precise intervention it's making is, and if it intervenes, and what it means if we want to say it directly intervenes on how we do politics, right? Versus how we think about doing politics, versus how we think about politics. You know, and there's probably like a distinction between like politics and the political here that might make it slightly clearer. But I think that's in terms of these questions about like efficacy and what can we get from this text to know something about what we can do. My concern is that these might be the wrong questions to ask of the text. And so that's something I'd want to say in terms of thinking through this.
Yeah, totally agree with Duncan's point. And I also like that's the first like the field of anthropology. The name is constituted by the question the statement people think puts to thought. So when you go to those places where the statement people think is made, there's something going on in those places that is already interesting at the level of thought. And anthropology, the name, is an inquiry into that, into what's already going on there. In the moment when the worker says, it is not the boss who determines how we count, it is we who determine how we count. That's the moment.
Yeah.
Not sure if you want.
I also think it's important just to note this question of how one periodizes a break between one mode and the other. It's just worth pointing out that he kind of defines that in a relationship between Marx and Lenin on page 44, where it was through success, right? So we're kind of talking about this kind of specific point of this kind of transition of the saturation of the Leninist mode in the late 70s, early 80s. We're talking about this as from the position of failure. But Lenin's seizure of the state, as you'll see here, also produced a similar caesura, just as a point. In other words, I don't want us to think that we have to think about the relationality between modes as just one way, or as just exhausted per se. I mean, it's exhausted, but it doesn't always come through the total inefficacy of all sites, is what I mean.
I heard someone else about to weigh in. I wonder if they...
Please.
I was just going to say, I don't want to risk adulterating Lazarus with Hegel too much, but this question of knowing when a lapse has occurred, you're just falling back into the paradox of knowing before knowing, it seems. That's all.
Yeah. Look, this is a fine point which we should flag, and I apologize. I did say this in the email, but I do have a request. Some of you have used the document on Google Docs where the takeaway from the session is to write a reflection, or to write a dump of notes as you wish. Length varies, can be anonymous, you can put your name, it does not matter. This is a method actually my friend Gabriel has recommended that we use, and I think it's a good one, that he uses in reading philosophical texts with a group like this. So the point is if you have just one reflection, that's adequate, that's fine, or one burning problem or one burning issue, or if you have multiple, throw it into this sort of document. There's a lot of us, but it will help the next facilitator next time. Kind of their first task will be to manage that document. Good luck to them, but that's the mode that we've decided to do with this text. I hope that will be helpful. At the minimum, it will help us to read where people's kind of questions are falling. And then the ideal point would be to sort of say, okay, there's a lot of overlap in this area, a lot of overlap here, and then address them. So that's a little project we can do as we continue to read. Other thoughts? Jerome has a point. How does one know what they're seeing is in fact a lapse? You know what? I think that this is such a burning, complex point. Let us table it as a. Is that okay, Jerome, for next time? Okay. I don't want to keep everybody too long. Okay, Chris says, can we summarize the last part of chapter 1 and take the discussion to Slack? Sure. Tom Davies, go.
Thanks. I just wanted to reply to what Duncan was saying about people are asking about practical outcomes or upshots. And I think the idea is not that this text is going to provide us with a set of prescriptive things to go out and do. It's more that if common practices of organizing aren't responsive to the phenomena into which Lazarus is inquiring, in the results of his inquiry ought to change how we organize. And at least speaking for myself, I'd like to keep at least some focus on how what we're reading should change what we're already doing, or impacts on what an organizer is thinking when they walk into a workplace. Just a clarificatory point. Thanks.
It's very helpful. That's very helpful. Well, where are we? We've sort of to Chris's point. Chris, we have jumped around the chapter this way and that way, and I'm having a hard time gauging precisely where my summary left off. The worker figure. We could go from there to the end, if that's helpful. So I do think that these summaries are useful, despite their generality. It helps us keep a sort of a discipline. So it says that the method of saturation, when applied to Leninism, shows that when you remove classism and you remove the categories of war and revolution, what remains is the figure of the worker. It says this on page 41. But it's important to bring out this figure. And in order to bring out this figure of the worker, we must separate history and politics to the references that Leninism relied on. So it's a way of isolating the worker. A way of isolating the worker which is not reliant on the same sites. Again, I have a note here where Lazarus cites the letter of Marx to Weidemeyer, where Marx says to Weidemeyer that class struggle is not my most important discovery. My most important discovery, Lazarus summarizes, is that history and politics are merged, and the name of this mergence is a certain historical consciousness. And Lazarus then, from that point, will obviously propose a decoupling of that mergence that Marx initially discovered. And he shows and argues that that mergence was efficacious when Marx discovered it. It is no longer efficacious now. So the point is that politics separates itself from history. And also for Marx, by the time of the manifesto, he actually is making a claim that one of the novelties of Marx's manifesto is basically the idea of placing and placement, and that placement is what embeds a separation, right? So you have a naming procedure, and then you have a placement of that name, and that placement enacts a separation, enacts an epistemological separation, if you like, right? And I think, yes, it is true that that separation follows the wider logic of Lazarus, which is a prescriptive mode. So Marx still has a prescriptive mode of politics. It's just that the global orientation was different, and that allowed for the relationship of history and politics to be differently formulated. Then he goes on to say that historians, intellectual historians, who he gains a lot of importance from, deal with history as composed of categories of classes, economics, the state, the bourgeoisie. These are all historical categories, but they are not political categories. That's very important. And therefore, for Marx, there is a fusion of history and politics under the category of placement and the prescriptive, under the category of placement. And then the prescriptive, he says, falls under the category of what he calls the communist class. So ultimately, actually, to go back to the letter to Wedemeyer, for which Badiou cites as one of the ways he sees the importance of the communist hypothesis for Marx, what Lazarus is saying is that the letter to Wedemeyer indicates that the novelty of Marxism is the prescriptive dimension of the communist class, which comes out of the manifesto. But he says the Bolshevik mode breaks with this understanding through their successful seizure of the state. And instead of being subject to consciousness, as it was for Marx, Lenin now sees consciousness of the worker in a completely different way. For Lenin, consciousness is now conditioned on an antagonism toward the existing social order. Thus, it cannot be argued that it is antagonism that constitutes consciousness. It appears instead to be one of its propositions. And this is a very interesting point I just want to make a reference to, which is that all of this stuff from Badiou and from Lazarus on the social, right, the status of the social, you know, they take a very anti-social, so to speak, it's kind of ironic to use that phrase, orientation, because I think that they're wanting to say something about the historicization of the present is such that the space of the prescriptive can no longer be afforded or is no longer brought about by antagonisms within the social as it was in Leninism. So this even gives more credence to the significance and the importance of politics in the prescriptive mode, i.e. politics that is anti-statist. So I think that helps us a little bit on understand that in the historical period of Leninism, the social had circulating within it the possibility for sites, and now it doesn't. That's how I read it. That's a very bold claim. This is a very bold thing. That means that the side of the social and the circulating antagonisms of it is not where separation is enacted. That's crazy. I mean, that's a very beautiful and bold point. So I think that about does it. We've gone through a lot today, and I want to encourage everybody to use the Slack and to do the note-taking exercise. And I want to just invite other sort of final comments before we go enjoy our Saturday nights as much as we can in quarantine, that is. Did Gabriel join us by chance? He was unable to. Maybe we should just stay on and have a virtual happy hour. I need to use the restroom pretty soon, but it really is a fun and exciting opportunity to be with you all. If we would have taken the time to introduce ourselves, I'm afraid that would have eroded over an hour. So I do apologize for that. But again, the Slack and other things, instead of creating discussion points, will be one way to learn about one another. Assad, do you have any points you want to make about what was left unsaid in our summary of chapter 1?
No, I think we can, you know, the Lacanians will know it's always important to end the session, then have a little thinking after that. So thanks, Daniel, for this coordination, and I'm looking forward to the next discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
It was a lot of fun. It was
Thanks, Daniel. Thanks, everybody.
really enjoyable.
Very helpful.
Bye, everyone.
We will see you on Saturday. All the best.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you. Andrew, how are you holding up?
Good, good. Thank you.
How is New York?
Well, you know, it's okay. It's good. It's weird. It's very, you know, it's a double thing. I've never my whole life ever experienced New York as quite so quiet and beautiful in that way. Sometimes it's like a village.
Yeah.
You know, right outside my window, I live on a very busy street normally. The other night there was a crazy fight between two cats who just occupied the middle of the street fighting as if I was in some upstate town. And but meanwhile, it's hard to of course shake that you're in the middle of what's been a very horrific situation.
No doubt.
So,
yeah, no doubt, no doubt. Eliran, it's really nice to meet you. All the best. What time is it? Are you in Israel?
No, I'm actually in Cambridge, and it's quite late. It's almost midnight here.
Okay.
I'll just see you next week. Thanks so much for organizing.
All the best. Yep.
Bye-bye.
Okay, I need to use the restroom, so I'll have to bounce, but I look forward to next time. And it's nice to see you, Andrew.
Ciao.
Since I've left Facebook.
Yeah, I know. You're gone.
Maybe I'll come back. We'll see.
All right.
I'll come back like Lazarus, of course.
Yeah.
All the best.